Good afternoon. I'm Dorothy Ridings, President of the League of Women Voters. Welcome to the League's second presidential debate of 1984. As we've done in previous presidential election years, the League of Women Voters is sponsoring a series of primary and general election debates so that you, the voter, can make side-by-side comparisons of the candidates and their views. John Chancellor, a distinguished journalist and commentator, is our moderator for today's debate. John?
Thank you. Gentlemen, when the League sponsored its last debate in New Hampshire, there were 8 of you. Now there are only 5. I must say you survivors look pretty chipper to me. And since then, 4 of you have not done as well, candidly, as you would have liked. Now let me describe your positions. Jesse Jackson, if he doesn't get 20% of the vote in a primary before April 6th, he will lose his eligibility for federal campaign matching funds. Mr. McGovern is down to campaigning in only one state, Massachusetts, and if he doesn't do well there, he may withdraw. Mr. Glenn has not yet scored a victory, and the opinion polls don't put him in a strong position. Mr. Mondale's hopes for a quick and decisive lead in all this hasn't been fulfilled, and I believe I've heard him use the word clobbered to describe one of his defeats. Mr. Hart has done well. He's presented himself as a man with ideas for the future, but his opponents say that's just tinsel, glamour but no substance. Well, on to the substance, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Jackson, you've got a lot of frontline combat experience in civil rights. Now that you're campaigning in the South, where there are a lot of black votes, you've been hitting that civil rights theme very hard, saying in effect that you're better than your opponents on that issue. Does this tend, do you think, to narrow your candidacy? There are a lot of white voters in New England who didn't rally to your Rainbow Coalition. Have you reached the point where your support will come almost exclusively from blacks?
Number one, in New Hampshire, I got 6% of the vote, which is better than 4 of my opponents, 3 of whom have subsequently dropped out. In Vermont, we got 8% of the vote, so we had an inclination of voting support in New Hampshire. Since we've come south, we focus on the question for farmers. Either they'll have 90% parity or they'll have 100% charity. Mr. Hart and Mondale can appreciate the fact that unless we undergird these farmers, they'll be driven out of business, all of them, and they're mostly white. Secondly, and unless Mr. Hart and Mondale are willing to cut the military budget and use those resources to help end that deficit and revitalize America, they represent a new president, but not a new direction. That affects everybody. Thirdly, the Voting Rights Act is the most critical act of the century. For unless Mr. Hart and Mondale have a plan to enforce the Voting Rights Act, do in second primaries and dual registration, gerrymandering, and annexation, they nor our party deserve the votes of the locked out. So the questions of parity, social justice, peace, and sharing power with women are critical to my agenda.
Thank you. Mr. McGovern, you've been kind of critical of Gary Hart recently. He was your campaign manager when you ran for president in 1972. Is his talk about the future, about opportunities for a new generation, really, Mr. McGovern, much different than what you were saying in 1972?
John, first of all, I think I probably trained Gary too well. I've been rethinking that whole business of '72. Let me just say that as one who has great special affection for Gary Hart and will certainly support him if he's the Democratic nominee, that I do think some legitimate questions have to be asked when the issue is posed as Gary has. He says the election is a contest between the past and the future. Now, I'm not sure what the past means in those terms. I'm very sensitive about this, as Gary knows, because I'm an old history teacher. I've always revered the past, but does the past include George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? Does it include Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy? Does it include the human rights policy of President Carter? If it does, I'm glad to come here today and claim the past and defend it as a good guide to the future.
Thank you. Mr. Glenn, we saw you in Iowa and in New Hampshire describing yourself as a businessman and an experienced senator. But in the South this last week, you seem to be describing yourself as a hero astronaut and a tough Marine. You've been all of these things. Admittedly, it's all in your record, but can you really decide what sorts of person you'll be in different parts of the country?
I don't think I've changed my views in any way, shape, or form. What you're talking about is the experience factor, which I have pointed out. I have been 10 years in Washington, have passed major legislation, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, for instance, so I know how Washington operates. But in addition to that, who's going to provide the jobs for the future in this country? Who knows the best from the White House? Someone who's been in business, as I have, started 4 small businesses of my own, was president of an international corporation. 1/3 of our agricultural production gets sent overseas normally. 1 out of every 6 American jobs depends on that. It's so important for the future. I've been in the research area. We talk about the future. I've been working in the future all my life. I was in the military, helping work on designing some of that equipment for the future. And so I have experience in that area. I have experience in the arms control area. I have experience in the business area, and I think those are very, very valuable additions, in addition to just being solely lifelong political entities. And so I think I add that extra dimension to it that would give a good dimension to the White House on making those decisions that you have to make.
Thank you. Mr. Mondale, as I understand it, your new theme is what you see in Mondale is what you get. No hairspray. You're saying I am what I am. You say you've resisted suggestions to change your image. That approach, it seems to me, may seem a bit short on issues, actual issues, and yet you accuse some of your opponents of running issueless campaigns.
That's the point of the comment, that I think substance is all that matters here. Are we right on the arms control issues? Do we see that that is the central issue of our time? Do we have a strong and sensitive plan to get those deficits down, restore America's competitiveness, to educate this next generation? Do we have the guts and the commitments to restore a sense of fairness in American life, backed up by the experience to get it done? That's what I'm trying to say. We don't elect momentum. We don't elect images. We elect a human being. And we better pick someone who knows what he's doing, who's committed to the strongest and most important elements directed to our future, and one who's seasoned and experienced and knows what he's doing.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Hart. One thing that I hear people say is, I don't know much about Gary Hart. I like his style. I like his looks. Isn't there some truth to your opponent's charges that your campaign is more impressionistic than theirs? That you are spending more and more time just being Gary Hart than outlining specific things you do if you were elected?
Well, Mr. Chancellor, that's a very good question at this stage of this race. Let me point out 2 facts. I have been a public servant, United States Senator, for 10 years and announced presidential candidate for over a year. When George McGovern, my good friend, says he doesn't know what these new ideas are, I'd remind him, last fall I sent him a copy of a book that I wrote and a stack of position papers about that high, as I think I have the campaigns of all these other people. The other thing is, these primaries are happening awfully fast now, and I oppose the way this calendar was set up. I, on the record, in the fall of 1982, told the Hunt Commission and the Democratic National Committee not to do this. I wish I had 3 weeks to campaign in Florida, and 3 weeks to campaign in Georgia, and 3 weeks to campaign in Alabama, because I'm convinced the ideas that I have to put forward would sell down here exactly the way they have the rest of the country. So I would hope in the future, when we nominate a president, that we give each of the candidates time to become better known in each of these states.
All right. I'd like to go on to some, thank you very much. I'd like to go on to some specific questionings now. Gentlemen, the figures on the American economy show that the country right now is having one of the best recoveries from a recession since the 1950s. The country is in better shape now than it was 4 years ago economically, 4 years ago when the Democrats were in the White House. I base that on the misery index, the public's expectations on inflation and unemployment. 4 years ago, the misery index stood at 20. Today, the misery index is down to 13. So I'm going to ask each of you, and now in random order, we'll skip around, why should somebody vote for the Democrats? Things are getting better. And I would like first to start with Mr. Mondale. The misery index, as I recall it, was first used by the Carter-Mondale ticket in 1976 as an indicator of how people feel. Would you care to address yourself to that?
As a matter of fact, I think it is now clear that these Reagan policies are about to deliver a misery index that we haven't seen for a long, long time. We see the interest rates rising dramatically. We see the stock market going down dramatically. Now we see a resurgence of inflation. They're now predicting maybe 8% by the end of the year. We have a good chance, if this continues, to choke off economic growth. More than that, the effect of these policies has been to give us the worst trade year in American history, about $120 billion commercial trade imbalance, some 3 to 4 million jobs lost as a result of that. These enormous deficits of $200 billion a year, as far as the eye can see, guarantee that long-term, sustainable, healthy economic growth is impossible, and we're loading our kids with a $1 trillion bill that they've got to repay with interest. It is the worst deliberate major economic mistake of modern times.
I'm going to call on Mr. Hart next.
2 points, Mr. Chancellor. As Fritz has very accurately stated, this generation, this government, is doing something that we have not done for 200 years in this nation's history, and that is steal from our children's future to satisfy a Reagan election year recovery and the greed of a handful of people in this country. Number 2, what that misery indicator doesn't measure is the anguish of our children who are desperately afraid of a nuclear holocaust, of the woman in Alabama who wrote me saying that she fully supported my effort to get our Marines out of Lebanon, and her son was one that didn't come back. The anguish of our citizens who are afraid of toxic waste polluting their water supply, young people who don't know whether they have a future education or a job beyond that, or the 9 million structurally unemployed people that Ronald Reagan has no plan whatsoever to put back to work. This president is not addressing the fundamental problems of this country's economy.
Mr. Glenn, would you address the question that I posed? Why the Democrats if things are doing well?
The misery index of our children, I would like to know what that is going to be. When we're talking $200 billion a year deficits and we're letting that drive interest rates up, we're driving down export abroad, we're cutting out jobs in this country of ours, we're increasing the misery index for our children. Anyone can live on borrowed money for a little while. But there are many things that are also going to have to go into that misery index for the future that this administration has taken a very short view on also. The misery index caused by cutbacks in education, the opportunity for our young people to go on to high school, go on beyond high school, get a decent education. I've put forward a 3-part program of Volunteers for America, where for service to their country, our young people can be assured of getting a college education. We're talking about the difficulty in investing in new plant and equipment here. We're talking about cutbacks in research. The Japanese, Germans, French increasing their research while we are cutting ours back. It's not just an economic matter now, it's economic matters for the future that are going to cause our children to live with an economic misery index that should not be their lot. We can do better than that.
Mr. McGovern?
Mr. Chancellor, Mr. Reagan has done something I didn't expect a conservative president to do. He's bought us a kind of an artificial recovery for some people by spending $200 billion a year more than he takes in. Now, I'm sure some of the viewers listening to the 5 of us think we're making partisan judgments here today about the president, but his own top economic advisor, Martin Feldstein, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, has said that this $200 billion deficit is a time bomb that's going to go off after the election. It'll drive interest rates right through the ceiling, and that's the end of the recovery. He's also said what's causing this enormous deficit. It's a wildly inflationary and extravagant military spending binge that goes way beyond any defense requirement we have. And secondly, it's an inefficient and unjust tax law that's permitting billions of dollars to go through the loopholes for the highest income corporations in the country.
Mr. Jackson?
My concern is that we feel the tragic pain of the misery index rising under Reagan, but then Democrats will not make a difference if we get off of the Republican elephant onto the Democratic donkey going in the same direction, just a little slower. If Mr. Hart and Mondale would not share that ticket with a woman, while women are 50% of our convention, they then add to the misery of women who need to become empowered.
Wait a minute. Would you go over that again? I got kind of lost.
Well, what I'm saying is that our convention is now 50% female. Women are seeking to become empowered. 70% of all poor children live in a house headed by a woman. Unless we empower women, then they will be more miserable. Secondly, if they maintain a commitment to raise the military budget, they can do nothing about Reagan's deficit. They're going the same direction, just a little slower. When I consider us spending $150 billion a year to defend Japan and Europe, when they're better able to help defend themselves now, when we're cutting aid to American education and extending aid to El Salvador, we are extending that misery. The misery index is on the rise. 34 million people now are in poverty, be 41 million by the end of this year. So from Wall Street down, things may be looking better, but the boat stuck at the bottom, for them things are much worse.
All right, now we get into a few minutes of freewheeling in which you are at liberty to attack one another, but let me just try one thing. Aren't most of you actually for an increase in defense spending?
Well, I'm not.
I'm not. I'm for a 25% cut.
You mean
in the president's budget, and I think it can be done without touching anything that's important to our national defense. I'm a bomber pilot from the Second World War. I would not advocate anything that I thought touched the essential defense of this country. But some of the most thoughtful people that have looked at that military budget say that it's just loaded with waste and cost overruns and non-competitive bidding. If we had somebody like Lee Iacocca as Secretary of Defense, and he would do for the Pentagon what he's done for Chrysler Motors, we could have a good, lean, tough defense force for at least 20 or 25% less money. And then you'd have some money to do some of these other things.
I sense that Jesse Jackson is not out of phase with that sentiment.
No doubt about it. The point is that the cost overruns is a factor that requires that we, at this point, have some kind of congressional oversight committee or some force that allows it to become managed. Right now, it is unmanageable. The no-bid contracts, the sole source contracts. The second dimension is I support the need for some conventional troops in Europe or Japan, but 300,000 troops in Europe, 50,000 in Japan. They are better able to help share some of that burden now. That can be cut, some of our unnecessary systems. Well, if we can cut the defense by at least 20 to 25%, the budget, without cutting our defense, that is the money to implement the new ideas.
Okay, now we've got two cutters. And as I understand the positions taken by the other three, by Mondale, by Glenn, and by Hart, it's for cutting what the president has requested in addition, but you still would favor a certain increase in the defense budget. Am I right, all three of you?
Well,
I think his hand was up first.
Let me respond, if I may. I am for reducing the Reagan military buildup by 140 to 150 billions of dollars in the next 4 to 5 years. And I've spelled out in great detail, as I think the only member of this group who has 10 years of experience on the Armed Services Committee, where those cuts must come. But I'll tell you why I disagree with both George and Jesse. One is that we have to increase, even over above Ronald Reagan, what we are paying our military personnel to retain the most skilled personnel, among other things, to avoid going back to a very divisive Vietnam-style draft. And second, even after spending $650 billion in the last 3 years under this administration, the Pentagon itself admits we have fewer combat-ready divisions than we had in 1980 under the Carter-Mondale administration. And that means even Ronald Reagan is plundering the readiness accounts of our conventional forces for a procurement buildup, which is going to make us weaker.
I believe, before we go on, maybe we can find a way to make this more understandable to the audience. Isn't it true that the president has asked for a 13% increase this year in the allocations for defense, allowing for inflation? That's a 13% increase.
What about real terms?
Bring it down
to 17, I think. Yeah.
All right, but I want to say 17 then.
It is
what would
17.
your figure be? I mean, in that context, 4 or 5% increase?
Mine is about 3.5 to 4%.
Okay, if we can keep it to that, maybe it'll make more sense to the audience.
Over the baseline that was established in 80.
Okay.
Not to argue with Senator Hart, I wouldn't.
Why not?
About a year and a half ago, he wrote a dissenting opinion in which he seemed to say he wanted as much or more military spending as Mr. Reagan. But let me make my point. I think one of the realities of modern presidential leadership is that as much as we want to bring that defense budget down, and I do, as much as we want to get rid of weapon systems that don't buy us defense, and I will, as much as we need a tough new system of bidding, of testing, of warranties, as much as we need arms control to help also bring down pressure, the inescapable fact is that the Soviet Union is a powerful military nation using its power irresponsibly in Poland and Cambodia and Afghanistan and Syria and elsewhere. And a President of the United States has to do everything he can to manage that budget sensibly and wisely but he cannot fail to effectively discharge the national security interests of our country. That's a tough balance, but a president must do it.
Would you give me a percentage figure? What are you,
Yes,
3, 4, 5%?
Yes, I would be at about 4%.
Okay.
I'm at about 6%. My two colleagues on the right here, I feel, and I've been talking about this for the past week, would cut our defense establishment beyond all reality as far as keeping the security of this country. Now, I have proposed cutting about $15 billion out. I've specified where that would be. It would be on the MX, be on the Division Air Defense, the Bradley Fighting Vehicle, and the Rapid Deployment Force, certain parts of that. The buildup of the Soviets has been relentless since those Cuban Missile Crisis days. The former Vice President would cut the B-1, the Nimitz carrier, the Trident, the cruise missile, the foreign troops he would cut back, he would cut the M1 tank, funds for the Volunteer Army, kill the shuttle, oppose procurement of the F-14, the Harrier, and AWACS. I propose that would leave this country emasculated. The only two of those he's pulled back from has been the Trident missile and the Trident submarine and cruise missile. Mr. Hart opposed the F-15, the F-18, the B-1, the Nimitz carrier, the Minuteman III, the AWACS add-on, the Patriot, Hellfire, MLRS missiles, and has gone to a program of leadership in Washington of smaller and simpler is better, rather than stressing our technology, and that's a fundamental difference between us. And I'm saying that every single thing we put out there has to work and work properly. But we cannot go back to a smaller, simpler day, or we wind up matching our numbers for numbers of troops versus the Soviets, as opposed to using what we've done in every war, and that is use our technology to keep from using so many people out there. Keep a distance between you and the enemy with our technology. I've fought in those wars. I know what it's like to be up there and want the best technology because my life depended on it. And so I do not agree with this smaller is simpler is better is cheaper approach that Mr. Hart has used, and I don't think most people across the South do either.
Let me just respond, if I may.
Now we've had 4 hands up out of 5 on this. It goes in this order, in the order of your requesting time. It goes Hart, Jackson, McGovern, Mondale.
I may want to get
and then you want to get back in.
That's not fair, John.
You're on.
What Senator Glenn doesn't address is the need for more units of all these things. We cannot afford more aircraft carriers when they each one cost $3.5 to $4 billion. We are behind the Soviets in submarines by a ratio of 3 to 1. We're falling behind in almost every category of weapon system in numbers because we're worshiping technology. I want to use our technological superiority to produce conventional weapons that work in combat in sufficient numbers to defend this country's interests.
Even Gary's argument now is still preparing to
You can make it to him.
to kill and be killed by the Russians. I think the point is, if we begin to use more of our energy on talking and negotiating and engaging in trade and technology and agriculture, and less of them preparing to fight, we can prepare to live. The fact is, we can wipe out the Soviet Union with 300 warheads. We got 10,000. The only reason we're alive tonight, they decided not to kill us last night. They're alive because we decided not to kill them. We're beyond defense. We're not talking about the terrorists. Who can overkill each other the most? That's uncivilized behavior. We need to begin to use our minds rather than our missiles and reduce this tension and go another way. We're simply wasting money killing people in the Caribbean, in Central America, in Lebanon. If we save the money we're using killing people there and save the money from cost overruns, we can cut the budget without cutting defense, begin to use our minds and go another way.
Senator McGovern.
There's one thing, John, that's really clear here today. There's no new idea coming from this side over here. What we've got is this same old argument. The Russians are coming. The Russians are about to jump on us. You can be very sure that same argument's being made over there in the Kremlin. The Americans are gaining on us. Both of these superpowers are literally scaring each other to death. Each side arming in the name of defense, each side piling up more and more of these weapons of destruction at a time when our societies are deteriorating. President Eisenhower, who probably knew more about these military matters than any other president since World War II, put it this way: if the military spends too much, it actually weakens the country by depriving us of other sources of national power: education, housing, transportation. a balanced economy. These are things that also have to do with our national strength, and I think we need a leadership that instead of trying to get the Russians to the bargaining table by a $1.5 trillion military buildup, has the common sense to say, we're ready to bargain right now. Reagan's undertaken this totally unjustified buildup on the theory that the Russians would then be more humble, and they've walked out on the arms negotiations.
See, I agree that the idea of just building up arms to sort of scare the Russians so then they will agree to whatever we want, as Reagan is demonstrating, will fail. I want to be understood as being totally committed to annual summit conferences, to arms control negotiations, to efforts to reduce tensions. I couldn't agree with you more. On the other hand, I don't want to misinterpret what you've said, but the Soviets are using their power in Poland, in Cambodia, in Afghanistan, in Syria in ways that are irresponsible and dangerous.
Fritz, how are you going to stop that with another 4% of military spending or another 40%? That's not going to change their relation to Poland or Afghanistan or these other areas.
I think we need to have a sensible and a strong defense, and I had really intended to respond to John Glenn. It's a question of balance and of sense and arms control. But the point I wanted to respond to John Glenn is, I am for a strong defense and a sensible defense. Let me give you one example. He singled out my opposition to the B-1. I am opposed to
a list of things.
That's right, and it was a gross distortion because in many ways I have stood for a strong defense, and I stand for it. I just wanted to give one example. The B-1, which I opposed, I support the stealth because it's a modern, advanced bomber that will take us into the next century. My position on that is exactly the same as Sam Nunn's here in Georgia. And Sam Nunn is probably the most respected single specialist in armed services in our country. I am against the MX, but I'm for the midget man. I think the Navy has to be scaled to proper proportion, and I would be for strengthening NATO. Those are all strong and responsible positions, coupled with an arms control position that reflect the realities of the world as I see them.
Mr. Glenn, if you would make your response as brief as possible, because otherwise we'll spend the whole day on this interesting topic.
I'm the only one here who's put forth a 5-point arms control program trying to scale arms down so that we don't have to have such big defense expenditures. Limitation, reduction in the nuclear area, enforcing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act so we prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to more and more countries around this world, involve the other nuclear weapons states in those negotiations, and overall arms control. Now that's a 5-point doable program. Gary mentioned the carriers. He and I had a debate, which I'm sure he'll recall, on the Senate floor 2 years ago on that. He talks about the cheaper carrier as the smaller one. But it shows such a lack of fundamental understanding of how sea power works, because you have to have a whole task force that goes with any carrier that gets out there. And the facts are you're trying to present air power at sea, and per combat aircraft at sea, it comes out to around $126 million per aircraft with the big carrier, including the task force expense, as opposed to $249 for Gary's proposal. We argued this on the Senate floor, debated it. I won that debate decisively about 2 years ago. So that's what I see as a lack of understanding when you don't have the experience in some of these areas to know exactly how these things function.
I believe the charge was fundamental lack of understanding, and
basically it.
Mr. Hart jumped out of his chair when you said that. And then after that, unless you want to sneak in before Gary Hart answers.
No, I just... every time, everybody needs to sneak in on Gary. You know, the thing about this argument, pro and con, all of it basically for a strong defense. Obviously, the more that we talk in terms of engaging in real trade, the less we're going to have these tensions. Where Reagan is vulnerable, and we keep talking in ways I think that kind of confuse the people, that he's cut breakfast programs out from children. He's cut lunch programs out. He's cut back on food stamps, hurting the rural farmer and the urban consumer. And while he cuts away food from children, he then got us arguing about prayer, premeditated prayer. Here's a man who doesn't go to church, got us arguing about prayer. And what concerns me about that is that he hasn't prayed in so long apparently, he's forgotten the structure of a prayer. You know, you don't pray for the food that just left. You pray for the food that you're about to receive. And in this instance, what we really should do is pray to remove the man that's removing the food. He's vulnerable at the level of the misery index. I mean, people are hurting. They are the people who are now unemployed have fewer benefits and less food and less medical care. Our base are those boats stuck at the bottom. So let's talk about a strong defense, but our domestic tranquility and internal stability has to do with saving our nation from the inside out.
Could I ask just one question, John, to anyone here that wants to respond to it? Every gentleman on this platform knows that if we let fly just 10% of the nuclear weapons we have targeted on the Soviet Union, every single man, woman, and child in the Soviet Union would die instantly. Now, what are we going to achieve building any further than that? What is it we're trying to do with a 4% increase or a 6%? Why not a cut in this enormous escalation that the president has on the drawing board?
Let me respond, because George, as a former bomber pilot, you will agree that there are differences between strategic or nuclear weapons and conventional ones. And if we are going to bring nuclear weapons down, we must have adequate conventional forces and pay the people that run them. Now, I don't see that paying an E5 or an E7 an adequate wage to stay in and make a career of defending this country is threatening or frightening the Russians. That's all I'm talking about.
Well, I agree with that. I think we can make certain modest increases in maintenance, in training,
that's what I'm
in pay scales, and you can, if you cut these enormously costly new systems as substantially as they should be, there'd be enough money to do the things you want to do without an overall increase.
Well, why is John Glenn attacking me for all these cuts I want to make, and you're attacking me for not cutting more?
Well, because he's the reason is John Glenn is further off than you are.
Listen, we'll go on all day, but it's all right with me. Last word on the subject. We have to go on.
Just a little one. The cost increase, and you point out very correctly, Jesse, or George, I guess it was, comment about the increase in nuclear. I don't think we need an increase in nuclear. I disagree with the president that we're behind in that area. What I do support very firmly is the idea of upgrading and making certain our conventional forces are adequate, so we, pray God, never reach that nuclear threshold and have any temptation on either side to go to a nuclear warfare. That's the reason I propose some of the nuclear proposals I have, too.
We are now, gentlemen, going to change the subject. I want you all to listen to this because you've all thought about sleeping in the White House. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. You're upstairs in that bedroom and you're sound asleep and the phone rings. An airliner from Czechoslovakia, a communist country, enters American airspace on a course directly across some SAC missile bases. It is headed for Colorado Springs and the North American Air Defense Command. American fighters have tried everything they can do to stop it, short of shooting it down, shooting across its bow, all of that, and they look in, the lights are on, and it's full of people. And there you are on the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. What are you going to do? And I'd like to start with Senator Hart.
If the people that they looked in and saw had uniforms on, I'd shoot the aircraft down. If they were civilians, I'd just let it keep going.
I would share the same judgment. As we saw with the Korean airline situation, when you shoot down an innocent civilian aircraft, and these things have markings. You don't have a civilian aircraft flying around that has military potential unless that military potential is obvious. When that is the case, it seems to me that you take every reasonable precaution to avoid the kind of crisis and the embarrassment and the humiliation of the heartache surrounding the Korean airlines. If, in the judgment of the president, this could be a potential attack, that's something else. But one further piece. What are the odds of your good question ever occurring? Do you really believe if the Soviet Union was after us, they'd fire up an old 707 and go putting across the air? or do you think they'd take modern stuff and let it all go? I think that's a wonderful hypothetical. It's ridiculous.
Does anybody disagree with, we have some disagreement, let me say.
Let me say, I think first there's such a fundamental lack of understanding by saying we're going to go up and peek in the window of this thing, see where they have military uniforms on.
That was Chancellor's. That was John's statement.
May be
he said you look in there and see people.
You said you're going to peek in.
No, that's what he said. That's what he said. That was Chancellor's question.
John,
I've been out there.
I hope that
I've
we
flown
can-
wing on these airplanes. You don't go up peeking in the windows.
I wish that we
But
would.
I think one important element here is very important, quite seriously, and that is that if we have an adequate intelligence service, which some of the others on the platform have supported cutbacks on in the past, where I've wanted to expand our intelligence service, then we know more about what the Soviets are doing. If we had an adequate satellite system that tells where that airliner came from, what information is there about what was loaded on that airplane, what was sent into the base from which it took off. There's a lot of information like that would go into it. It's not just as simplistic as you make it, John, nor has it been made
All
here.
right, I'd like to go to would you?
Well, my point is,
just briefly, if you
I wish
can.
we would get on to something real. I think the answer to that question was Fritz's finest hour in 3 weeks.
Thank you for the brevity of your response.
John, I think what both this hypothetical example points out, and in all due respects to you, I think it's ridiculous, but what it points out, as well as the Korean jetliner incident, fundamentally, is the necessity of better communications between Washington and Moscow. One of the great tragedies, I think, of the last 3 years is that the President of the United States hasn't even talked for 60 seconds to the leader of the other superpower. In fact, 2 of their leaders have died during the time President Reagan was in office without ever meeting our president. If we had systematic, regular talks between the President of the United States and his counterpart in the Soviet Union, it's quite possible we would have avoided the Korean jetliner incident and this hypothetical matter that you pose.
Well, thank you for
I
making-
think if World War III comes, it'll be because of a communications breakdown.
All right, I'd like to go on to something else, gentlemen. You're all Democrats, which means that you are the political heirs of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Half a century ago, when Mr. Roosevelt became president, the United States began to change. The federal government took over many of the responsibilities of the states and of the cities. We've had half a century of continued federal involvement with people's lives, and it seems to some of us as though it's grown much in those years. The election of 1980 may have changed that, at least many Republicans think so. Now, if one of you wins the election, I think this is a really serious question. Will there be less federal involvement, or will it be a return to the way things were before Reagan? And I wonder, Mr. Mondale, if you'd start the answer.
I think it's essential that the President lead us with a strong federal government to solve those problems that are essential to our future. Number one, to get those deficits down dramatically, because if we don't do that, we can't have a healthy economy. Number two, to have a strong, new, assertive American trade policy. This is the worst trade year in American history. All through Georgia and Alabama and Florida, farmers, industrialists. Alabama's got 13.5% unemployment today. There's a lot of people left behind. A lot of that is principally because of the trade disaster. We need a renaissance of learning and education and science and training. If this next generation is going to be able to defend themselves and compete, they simply must have the support. Finally, we need a president who leads us toward justice. And I mean enforcing those civil rights acts. I mean ratifying that Equal Rights Amendment. I mean standing up for Social Security and Medicare. This country must be fair. And the history of America is that when a president leads us toward fairness and toward our future, it can be done.
2 comments, Mr. Chancellor. First, I've made quite an issue out of the need for a new generation of leadership. I mean primarily those who have come into political life and leadership in the past decade, and that's because there is a strong anti-government feeling out there. Now, I fundamentally disagree with Ronald Reagan when he says he loves his country and yet he hates our government. I don't hate our government. I think we ought to have leaders that ask people what they can do for their country using the best instruments of our government. But I think there is a fundamental difference, for example, between Vice President Mondale and myself. That is, I think we can meet the basic human needs and commitments of the people of this country by restoring entrepreneurship. 90% of the new jobs in this society have come from small businesses, and I think the dedication of the Democratic Party to minority people in the South and elsewhere shouldn't just be jobs. It should be the opportunity to own and operate businesses that create jobs.
Mr. Glenn?
Can I respond to that?
Well, we'll come back to you. Let some of the others
What's new about coming out from entrepreneurs? You know, when
Well,
I
but
when I
there's
hear
some-
when I
there are some
what-
specific
when I
ways
hear
to do that,
when I
Fred.
hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef?
Yeah. If you'd
Let's keep going to the
no,
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. He's going to tell you where the beef is or the roll or
if
something.
you'd Fritz, if you'd listen just a minute, I think you'd hear. No, you haven't. One of the other differences, by the way, is if a president goes back into office, and one of us must, I think, to save this country, you cannot go back so committed to a handful of constituency groups that you cannot make this economy grow again. And that's, again, a major difference, I think, between myself and Walter Mondale.
Wait a minute. I told you what I was going to do, get those deficits down, educate the next generation. Those aren't special interest groups. I said I'm going to stand up for against special interests and I'm going to support Social Security and Medicare. What's wrong with that?
Nothing wrong
Isn't that
with
right?
Okay, now, well, I'd like to move on. Mr. Jackson and then Mr. Glenn.
Critical to your question, the role of the government is to be a balancing wheel between big labor and big management. The government must assume basic responsibilities to enforce the laws. Right now, the Voting Rights Act, for example, is not being enforced. Democrats are reluctant because we want to reconcile the interests of the boll weevil and the cotton. You can't have both. Georgia, for example, right now, 30% black, 18 years after the Voting Rights Act, 10 congresspersons, 0 black, Supreme Court, 0, Appeals Court, 0, 159 sheriffs, 0, 22 majority black counties without 1 black elected official. The government must enforce the law and not equivocate in the face of local considerations. On the other hand, we keep focusing on what would the government do. The private economy is $3 trillion. 5 of every 6 jobs is in the private economy. For that $700 billion tax break to corporations, they must be obligated to reinvest in this economy, retrain our workforce, and not export our jobs to slave labor markets abroad. We can no longer allow these corporations to take this money, replace people with robots without any sense of an adequate transition. And that's a strong central government that's a balancing wheel.
Mr. Glenn.
Back when I was a boy in New Concord, Ohio, in the Great Depression, we estimate we had about 51% of the people at or below poverty level. FDR came in. My dad went to work on WPA. We had a lot of programs, but FHA at that time. It helped a lot of people. We estimated just a few years ago, only 9% of the people of this country were at or near poverty level. That's a record of social revolution in this country. It didn't happen with socialism or fascism or communism. It happened with good, solid democratic programs, and we can be very proud of those programs. Now, along with that, we went a little too far in some of those programs, and we have to correct those. And now you're talking about intrusion of government. And there are some areas where I think that we have some very major differences. I spelled them out between myself and Mr. Hart just a couple of days ago. ERA, he has said that he would use that, and I'm for ERA, proud that Ohio led the way with that, but he said that ERA, he would use the power of the federal government to withhold projects.
No, I didn't.
For nations. Yes, you did, Gary.
No, I
I'll read
didn't.
it to you.
No, I didn't.
And yes, you did. Well, let me just read it if I have enough time here.
You can read it on the next turnaround.
I will. Fine, but he said he'd withhold federal projects. Now, that's an intrusion as far as I'm concerned. I think that is flat wrong. When you're going to intrude into people's lives on that basis with federal projects. He's had an industrial policy that says that
Mr. Glenn,
we want to make choices in credit and allocate those things, and that intrudes the federal government into business.
Mr.
And
Glenn,
into your lives. Yes,
I'm
sir.
awfully
All right,
sorry,
good.
but if you continue, we're going to take that out of your closing statement.
I'll give up the closing statement.
We haven't heard from George McGovern on this question about the federal role in American life.
John, I think there are 2 types of concentration of power we have to worry about in the United States. One is the danger of too much federal concentration, and the other is too much corporate concentration of power. On the federal side, to my surprise, President Reagan has increased the percentage of GNP now being taken up by the federal government. The reason for that is obviously the dramatic increase in military spending. He has cut nutrition, education, the environment, and things like that, but those cuts are less than the increase in the interest rate on the federal debt since he took office because of this escalating deficit that he's brought on. On the corporate side, we've had more huge corporate mergers in the last 3 years than at any previous time in American history. Enormous oil companies taking over others to the point where I think it's a real call on all of us to see what we can do to strengthen our antitrust laws.
Do you Democrats now think that the private sector, as the President so often says, can pick up the slack in certain federal programs that have been going to people? Would you? This is open now. You can all talk for a few minutes.
First of all, I think that a private, healthy economy is indispensable to everything. If you don't have a growing, healthy economy with entrepreneurship and small businesses and so on, we're not going to solve anything. The key here is to make certain that the prosperity and the entrepreneurship is found in minority communities as well. There's a lot we can do through the Small Business Administration, through tax incentives, through federal licensing laws to make certain that more black, Hispanic, women, and other minorities can participate in the fullness of the profit making. Thirdly, through training and education and the rest, make certain that people who are now being left behind are made a part of this process. All of that depends on a private, healthy economy. That's why you got to get those deficits down and get going with an environment where we can prosper.
When I was with Operation Push, we began to challenge corporate America. When Reagan cut down on aid, we began to move toward trade. Burger King, for example, has made the judgment to build a plant in the middle of Eutaw, Alabama, as a part of our agreement. There they will hire 200 people. They will stop some small farms from going out of business by guaranteeing a market of 5 million pounds of cucumbers a year. If a company does that, they ought to get a tax incentive. If a corporation, for example, puts a daycare center as its plant, which allows the mother to come to work, spares her of workfare and welfare, that ought to be worth a tax incentive. If a company gets a tax investment and then uses that money to reinvest in this economy and retrain our workforce, rather than closing plants on workers without notice going abroad, the use of tax incentive as leverage for urban development is the creative use of tax incentives and leverage.
Thank you, Senator Hart. And then after Senator Hart, I would warn you, gentlemen, we have time for one more response on this before, I'm afraid it's gone terribly quickly, I have to ask you to go into your closing statement.
I'll be brief, Mr. Chancellor. In the almost 10 years in the Senate, I've cast 5,000 or 6,000 votes. Vice President Mondale in his campaign has pulled out about half a dozen of those to attack me, showing that I'm not for this and not for that. I'll give you one example. One of those was a vote on OSHA. Now, Vice President Mondale knows full well that I am absolutely as committed to a safe workplace as he is. The vote was this, and it illustrates the point and the difference. It was to exempt from certain paperwork requirements small businesses in this country who had 10 or fewer employees and farmers who employed fewer than 5 people. It was that burdensome bureaucracy and paperwork that drove the Democrats out of office in the 70s. Now, I think we can have a safe workplace for people on farms and in factories without driving small business people and family farmers off their land or out of their businesses.
I saw that vote, but I've never mentioned it. The one I talked about is where, unlike Senator Nunn and Senator Childs and others, you refused to vote a windfall profits tax, if you had been successful, would have given big oil $250 billion. Secondly,
there you go again, Fitz.
I am going straight ahead here. Secondly, I talked about your $10 a barrel tax. That is the worst idea in this campaign.
It was a Carter-Mondale initiative.
No, I have nothing to do with it. It's the worst idea. Carter's not for it. Nobody except you's for it. And you're not talking about it anymore. It's so bad.
Oh, yes, I am.
500,000 people.
Right away.
500,000 people lose their jobs. America will become the highest cost producing area in the country. Talk about intrusion and destruction of jobs and entrepreneurship and position in international trade. This is a disaster, And I don't think you thought it through.
Well,
I don't
Mondale,
believe you really...
Let me respond. Let me respond.
Yeah, let me just finish my point.
This is a bad idea.
With that idea.
Mr. Chancellor.
I wish these two would
Mr.
stop
Chancellor.
whining.
Yes.
John,
You know, I'm terribly worried.
Yeah.
You either have a choice, it seems to me, and I'm sorry, but the clock is inexorable, of having a chance to say what you want to say at the end, or squeezing it there at the very end. And so, Senator, could you just say it in 25 words or less?
Less than that. I voted for a Carter-Mondale
seconds.
tariff on imported oil, and I was only one of about 15 senators that had the courage to support this administration. And the second thing is, I proposed a windfall profits tax of 100% on old oil owned by the big oil companies in this country, and that goes beyond the Carter-Mondale.
My 25 seconds. This is a complete distortion of what he did. Can I have 25 seconds?
It is not a distortion.
John,
You voted...
You know what you fellas are?
when we
Some of
needed
you are big spenders with the time
When we needed
here.
you, you were wrong.
No, that's not right.
That is correct.
No, I'm going to ask you now if we're going to get your reasoned closing statements. We'll all take a breath. I'm sorry, Senator McGovern, but we've got to do that. And the first one we've asked, and this was preordained by lot, the first one who goes is Senator Hart.
Mr. Chancellor, I have no idea how the primaries and caucuses are going to come out next Tuesday or beyond. I obviously hope that I will be successful. I hope so for several reasons. George McGovern talked about the great leaders of our past, Democratic and otherwise, and my values are as deeply rooted in those leaders and that past and those ideals as any person on this platform, indeed in this country. But it's interesting that the leaders he mentioned represented something else than just ideals and principles. They represented change. When this country has had to change, it came to this party for those who had a policy and a set of ideas and a vision for this country's future. That is what this campaign is all about, and I think that's why people are responding to it all across this country. We cannot go back. To achieve the highest ideals, values, and goals of this country, we must have new leadership and a new approach and a fresh start for this country.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson.
If we in fact have new leadership that replaces old leadership but basically going in the same direction, not sharing parity with farmers, not sharing the ticket with a woman, increasing the military budget, resisting a real commitment to enforce the Voting Rights Act, that's a new face or a new name but an old game. We need to go another direction. Our party must be the party of conscience. The fact is that under Reagan there are 5 million more people who are poor, 3 million more children. Now up to 34 million, 15% of our nation, it will be 41 million by the end of this year. There must be a commitment to lift those votes that are in fact stuck at the bottom. We must reduce the military budget without reducing our military defense, use that money to in fact create a future for our children, that they might be able to lay bricks and not throw them. If we give our children a chance, they will give our nation a chance. I remain convinced that we will suffer, but suffering breeds character, character breeds faith, and in the end, faith will not disappoint. We must pursue those values.
Mr. McGovern.
John, I hope that since Gary and Fritz have both objected to being called the front runner, that they'll let me be the peacemaker and take that label with me back to Boston when I go tonight. Franklin Roosevelt once said that the presidency is preeminently a place of moral leadership. I think that's true, and I think it means the next president is going to have to seek above all else our salvation from nuclear annihilation. But second only to that, we've got to learn in this great country to quit intervening in these third world revolutions, whether it's El Salvador or Nicaragua or Lebanon or wherever it is. Unfortunately, in the name of fighting communism, we've embraced virtually every scoundrel around the world who's willing to wave an anti-communist banner. And I think the time has come for the United States once again to assert in foreign policy not so much what we hate and fear, but what this great country is for, and that ought to be the goal of the next president.
Thank you. Mr. Glenn?
Thank you, Mr. Chancellor. I do regret something George just brought up here, that we had not had more of an opportunity to talk a little bit more about foreign policy, because I think that's so important, what happens around the world, nuclear arms-wise, that I mentioned earlier. But I do not agree with Gary that this is a generation gap of some kind. We go ahead as a nation and always have in the past, as we had the best interests of all of our people, of the young, of the middle-aged, of the elderly, and as we had concerns for everyone within our society. The South has a unique opportunity to set that course next Tuesday. It's a unique opportunity for leadership in the Democratic Party and for leadership for our nation. I see myself as the moderate, the only moderate left here. I don't believe in this politics of momentum that seems to be abroad, politics of stampede, whatever you want to call it. I hope the people of the South will slow down, think about the issues, and think about the position we've taken on the economy and foreign policy and education and research and these things, and then vote on what you know about what we actually have proposed. We can control the destiny of this country. We can be number one in this nation of ours again. George McGovern a few weeks ago said he didn't want people to throw away their conscience.
Senator?
I say don't throw away your common sense either. Your vote next week, and I will guarantee you I'll give you a presidency you can be proud of once again.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Mondale.
Here in the South and throughout our country, we're about to participate in Super Tuesday. The most important single question is whether the president you want is someone who will ensure our national security and will work for peace. That takes someone who knows what he's doing. This may well now be a two-man race between myself and Senator Hart.
Disagree with that.
If you look at the records, I think something is disclosed. A few days ago, Senator Hart said that if Persian Gulf oil were interrupted, that the Allies would be on their own and they couldn't look to us for help. In my opinion, that is naive. All history teaches us that we must stand together as an alliance and work together for the security of the Western world. Some time back, he was asked whether Cuba was a totalitarian state, and he said no. That is wrong. It is a communist dictatorship, and a president must know the difference. He has had a record on arms control, which is weak, and we need a president who will push forward and provide the leadership that this country needs for our national security and to achieve the peace.
Well, I want to thank you all. We've come to the end of this. As I think the Reverend Jackson said, did you not just say a minute ago that suffering breeds discipline?
No, suffering breeds character.
Suffering breeds character. You all have such terrific characters because of the suffering you have gone through. We thank you for being with us today. The next League of Women Voters debate is going to take place in Pittsburgh on April the 5th. We're not supposed to take sides in this. I suppose it would be very nice if all 5 of you were to join the League of Women Voters there, but who can say? As you say, Reverend Jackson, suffering breeds character, and this is a business that does it. Thank you very much.